Macedonian Phalanx, 5 Things You Should Know. By the very intrinsic nature of the Greek lands and topography, large-scale cavalry forces were never an option for most burgeoning city-states of Greece. This was especially due to the rough nature of the terrain that was not exactly conducive to the trotting of unshod horses. In essence, their relative geographical position made Greeks the men of the spear, a military tactic that preferred tight formations over extensive battlefield maneuvering. This tradition of hoplites ultimately made way for the famed Macedonian Phalanx and their Greek successor states, thus dominating the battlefield for the next century after Alexander the Great's death. 1. A force not inspired by either Spartans or Athenians. The Spartans were dealt a stinging defeat at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, by not their long-term rival Athenians, but rather by the upstart city-state of Thebes. This ensured a brief period of Theban military supremacy in the 360s, with its influence and primacy reaching the northern Greek states of Thessaly and Macedon. Suffice it to say, an impressionable man named Philip, who was the youngest son of Macedonian king Amyntas III, took note of the great Theban general Epaminondas and his fascinating tactics, one of which involved the so-called Sacred Band, an elite military force that was often specified as having 150 pairs of homosexual lovers. Now, while explicit evidence of Macedonian pederasty in their military is still not found, there are literary anecdotes on how such relationships played their larger role in political affairs in Philip's time. However, beyond sexuality, it was the scope of advanced battlefield tactics of the Thebans that was seriously inspirational to Philip and his Macedonian phalanx. And, as the saying goes, necessity is the mother of all inventions. By the time Philip assumed the reign of the nascent Macedon, the state's army was all but vanquished, with their earlier king and many of the Hetairoi, king's companions, meeting their gruesome deaths in a battle against the invading Illyrians. In essence, Philip had to tread carefully and take advantage of both delicate diplomacy and military innovation in order to keep his state and kingship intact. 2. Macedonian Phalanx was originally composed of seminomadic herders. The Macedonians had one significant advantage over other southern Greek city-states, and that ironically related to simple living. In other words, the Greek hoplite was essentially a farmer who was tied to his land, and such made up the bulk of the middle class of his society's economy. This resulted in more stringent campaigning seasons since the hoplites couldn't be too far away from their agricultural lands. However, as for the developing state of Macedon, most of its male population took part in simpler economic activities, like herding animals, based on seasons. So, during times of war, when such conscripted men campaigned far and wide, their economics tasks could also be alternatively handled by older men, women and even, in certain cases, children. Essentially, manpower was never a problem for the Macedonian kings, with the kingdom's burgeoning population spread across numerous villages, as opposed to being concentrated in urban centers or polis. These simple yet hardy folk were given the incentive for better economic benefits, read, plunder, that could have supplemented their meager incomes. And thus the factor that limited other Greek city-states, allowed Macedon to field a professional phalanx army which was properly motivated and prepared. As Alexander the Great made it clear to his troops, during the mutiny at Opis. 3. A standard phalanx comprised light-armored infantrymen. According to Polyaenos' account of Macedonian military training, the infantrymen of the phalanx were traditionally armed with helmets, chronos, light shields, pelt, greaves, nemides, and a long pike, sarissa. Now on closer inspection, we can comprehend that the armor is conspicuously missing from this list of items. Going forward to a period 100 years after the death of Alexander the Great, there are accounts of Greek successor states' phalanx functioning without any sort of heavy armor. From such literary sources, one can surely put forth this conjecture: the Greek and Macedonian armies completely abandoned their unwieldy bronze cuirass. Instead, most of their military forces adopted the much lighter linothorax, an evolved armor system made from glued layers of linen. Interestingly, one of the accounts of Polyenus, in Strategemata, records how Alexander spitefully armed his men who had previously fled the battlefield with the so-called hemithorakion, a half-armor system that only covered the front part of the body. This punitive experiment made sure that the soldiers wouldn't turn their backs on the enemy. Lastly, in terms of practicality, heavy metallic breastplates would have been unnecessary for the well-drilled soldiers in the rear-end ranks of a guarded phalanx. This must have been a tactical, and practical, advantage that was welcomed by the kings who were usually short in funds and military equipment. This in turn led to a non-uniform nature of a phalanx, which is surely a far cry from the incorrect, heavy depictions of Greeks and Macedonians in popular media. 4. The phalanx was more trained than comparable Greek hoplites. While the traditional Greek hoplite espoused the bravery and lofty ideals of the citizens of a Greek polis, the Macedonian phalanx could be seen as a tight formation of soldiers specifically engineered for war and survival. In essence, the sense of professionalism was more widespread in the Macedonian phalanx, where the troops preferred better army formation over individual prowess of a soldier, thus foreshadowing the evolution of the future Roman legions. Such tactical factors could only be perfected on an actual battlefield and supported by a rigorous training regimen. To that end, according to Polyenus, Philip passionately drilled his soldiers by sometimes forcing them to march over 300 stades, 30 miles, in a single day. This was done with the fully adorned equipment of the phalangite, including his unwieldy sarissa spear that was designed as an 18-feet-long pike made of cornel wood, during Alexander's time. And, in spite of the seemingly rigid formation of the phalanx on the battlefield, Philip preferred the mobility of his army when in the marching phase. This led to the curtailing of many facilities for the officers and soldiers, including the reduction in servants for each man. This might have resulted in a single servant for 10 to 16 troops, while the soldiers were expected to additionally carry their rations for 30 days. By Alexander's time, such efficient features were complemented by a slew of exercises, drills, and simulated maneuvers, all achieved on a large scale within the training grounds. Interestingly, one of the ostentatious parade ground drills was expertly demonstrated by the army of Alexander the Great in an actual battlefield, in a bid to both impress and intimidate the opposing forces of Illyrians in 335 BC. 5. Members of the Macedonian phalanx were subject to harsher discipline. According to Polyenus, one particular incident related to how a Tarentine cavalry officer was dismissed from Alexander's army just because he took a bath in warm water. The simple enough reason was, for he did not understand the way of the Macedonians, among whom not even a woman who has just given birth bathes in warm water. The members of the Macedonian phalanx were also subject to similar codes of conduct, and as such the ultimate power of endowing judgments rested with the king, as opposed to more democratic means in other Greek armies. Such disciplinary actions and punishments, of course, varied in accordance with the nature of the crimes committed. For example, simple insubordination often required the soldier/s to stand in an attentive posture for extended time intervals while wearing his full war panoply, thus mirroring our modern-day military. However, in some cases relating to the violation of dress codes and inadequate maintenance of weapons, the soldier was required to pay a fine. These monetary sums were specified in accordance with the type of equipment that was deemed to be in an inappropriate condition during the routine inspections. But beyond fines and simple chastisements, there was a dark, brutal side to the Macedonian army, especially when the times were tough. In that regard, the protection of property was a big deal, with the accumulated plunder being divided and specifically allocated to each soldier based on his rank. Oddly enough, the ambit of loot and property also included women, and as such those who were carried off as booty were often perceived as the common-law wives of the soldiers. More intriguingly, the punishments were very strict for seducing women, and thus property, of other soldiers, sometimes even resulting in death sentences. Gruesome forms of executions were also reserved for mutineers, with punishments ranging from being stoned to death, being hurled into rivers, to even being trampled by elephants.